Good morning and welcome to the Daily Aus. It's Monday, the 4th of May. I'm Sam Koslowski.
I'm Zara Seidler.
Last week, the federal government finally announced a long-awaited draft that is set to regulate the relationship between social media companies and news companies. Now, this comes after a number of years of consultation, of which TDA was a part, and it's now up to the tech companies and news companies to respond to the draft before it's set to hit Parliament later in the year. And so we thought on today's podcast we'd do something a little bit different. We'd explain a bit of what the legislation sets out to achieve, but also how it might impact TDA and potentially your social media feeds.
Sam, if anyone has deja vu and they're like, Zara and Sam, we've definitely heard you rabbiting on about this before.
I swear they've talked about this before.
I swear they brought back their old font to talk about this before. You would not be mistaken.
No.
It was actually around the time, this is so tangential, but I'm going to go with it. It was around the time that you and I were both getting married and we were like really convinced the government was going to come out with something on our wedding days, our separate wedding days, but not married to each other, about the relationship between big tech and media companies and that was going to have huge implications for TDA.
Yep.
Turns out the conversation that we had back then, so that was a number of years ago now, didn't actually transpire into worst case scenario. Instead, it's all led us to here, to again talk about media bargaining and money changing hands between big tech and media companies.
Yeah, and one of the things I was thinking about in the lead up to this podcast is actually whether people deeply care or not.
Yeah,
like
I had this whole conversation with the editorial team. They pitched it to write for the feed, for our Instagram feed, and I was fully convinced that not a single person outside of you and I care about it.
Yeah.
But it turns out that was wrong.
I think it's when you have these kind of two different spheres that people are very invested in, where they get their news from and how they get their news, and also social media. Yeah. When you get a sense that there's tensions between the two of them, when there's change on the horizon, I kind of understand now why people care. And there's a lot of nuance in this law, though, that I think that people can kind of benefit from understanding.
Okay, so let's get to the headline first of what was actually announced last week and why we're talking about it. And then I think it would be helpful to step it back so that that deja vu is actually realised and you understand why you've heard it before. So start with, what was the headline of last week?
So the headline of last week is that the new News Media Bargaining Incentive, NMBI, has been released in the draft form by the government, and they've asked for media to have a look at it and social media companies to have a look at it before they table it in Parliament. Which
is a very normal thing to do. Yep. Often when there is legislation, the government will put it out and say, consult us, let us know what this is about, what you think, what you feel if you're a stakeholder, and then they kind of go away, finesse it, and then put it forward to Parliament.
Exactly. But if you take this all the way back, this really is about a concern from news media companies that the revenue
and the government
that the revenue that they used to get, mainly through advertising, has been replaced by those advertisers now using social media companies. So let's say that you run a carpet shop. You might have taken out an ad in the Sydney Morning Herald or the Daily Telegraph. Maybe now you put that ad on Instagram or Facebook. And so we've seen social media companies' revenues go up a lot since they came onto the scene in 2007-ish. And we've seen news companies' revenues decrease dramatically. And one of the arguments made by the news organizations is the social media companies benefit from news companies posting on there.
I feel like that's the big thing is that news companies say, we are bringing millions and millions and millions of eyeballs to your platforms because we post our original content that costs money to make, videos, articles, whatever it is, and that you get all the benefit of having those eyeballs and you can monetize those eyeballs, but we don't get any benefit. You don't pay us for bringing all of that attention to your platform.
And so the solution in the eyes of the large media companies is that social media companies should pay news companies as a kind of an indirect profit share to keep news healthy, which is a public good in many ways, and we need it in society, and also recognise that the landscape has shifted. Yeah. So that's kind of the core premise of where this all comes from.
So let me just summarise it in a sentence.
Yeah.
Big tech, so players like Meta, TikTok, whoever it is, should pay media companies like the Daily Aus for bringing people to their platforms, and that should take the form of millions and millions of dollars that they are compelled to pay us.
Exactly.
Cool.
That's kind of the starting point.
So what's the problem?
Well, the big problem that's taken everybody now almost over a decade to try and solve is how.
Yeah.
How do you actually go about implementing a scheme like that? The social media companies are saying that's not how this works. In fact, we help drive traffic to news companies. And, in some ways, if they're being particularly cheeky, they should pay us.
Yeah.
And the news companies are saying, no, you should pay for the content.
And in 2021, we had the first iteration of this sort of regulation. That was the News Media Bargaining Code. And there was a slight hiccup where Facebook took news off its platform for a day or two, but ultimately it did eventuate into Meta, it was Facebook at the time, and Google paying millions and millions and millions of dollars to news media companies.
Yeah.
And for a little while, it almost seemed like that was the status quo, that's how it was going to work. They were going to pay them in these deals, and that was that.
Yeah, and that all came to a crashing halt in mid-2024.
Which is when you last heard about us talking about this.
Yeah, where Meta basically said, those deals that we've got with you, news industry, we're not doing them next year.
Yeah.
So they were being renewed every 12 months.
Yeah.
And then Meta just said, we're kind of finished with them.
Yeah. And they said we're finished with them because we don't think that there is a whole lot of traffic on Meta that is news related.
Exactly. So, it's a whole lot more complicated than how we're making it. They're thinking constantly about international examples, and if they do one particular way of complying with law in one country, does that mean they have to do it in the other 194? All of that kind of stuff. But essentially, yes, that they see their platforms not as a news platform.
Yeah.
Why should we be doing it?
We've tried to change that.
Yeah, and we've had a lot of fun doing it.
Yeah.
And so when that changed, the government kind of said they were going back to the drawing board.
Yeah.
This was a different government now. We had the Morrison government was the government responsible for the News Media Bargaining Code.
Famously, Josh Frydenberg calling Mark Zuckerberg in the dead of the night to try and negotiate out this deal.
Yep. And now we've got the Albanese government now looking at what the next iteration will be.
I'm just going to add a tidbit here.
Yep.
I don't know if anyone cares. So Josh Frydenberg was the treasurer, which would have meant that Jim Chalmers, the current treasurer, would be the person in charge of this.
Yep.
He's not, because his wife works for News Corp, and thus he is conflicted out.
Very interesting, isn't it?
And so we don't have the treasurer. We've got someone else taking over this process. I don't know why I added that, but I did.
It's very interesting in terms of, that's why you see the Assistant Treasurer, Daniel Molino, up there with the Prime Minister making those announcements last week.
Is this on? It's Billy from TDA, and we are wondering if you can hit subscribe to help this channel grow. Now, back to the video.
Okay, so just before the break there, Sam, you were talking about the fact that there was a deal in place, millions of dollars flowed between big tech and media companies.
Yep.
And I know that we'll probably get into this a bit later, but I feel like it should be said very explicitly. The Daily Aus was not one of those companies who benefited from the scheme. We'll talk about why that was a little later. But that stayed in place until 2024 when Meta said thanks but no thanks.
Yep.
Google, it should be said, didn't. Google renewed a lot of its deals and has continued to invest in news media companies. But there was still this issue of Meta contravening the law. And basically the government was faced with a few options. Do they ignore it? Do they just let Meta do whatever they're doing for fear of not wanting to piss off, sorry, I don't know if I'm allowed to say that, but piss off one of the biggest companies in the world?
Yeah.
2, do they force them to negotiate? And what happens if they just spit the dummy? And we saw in Canada that meant all news was taken off all Meta platforms.
Which it still is to this day.
Which it still is. Hello, all Canadians who can only listen to us or read our newsletter. But the government chose C, which was we're just going to design a new scheme. So talk me through it.
They've come out with a brand new piece of legislation that has all different rules for us to try and figure out. These are notoriously
just getting our head around
complicated.
The last one.
They're so complicated. So I think I've nailed the way to try and explain it simply. So basically what they've said is if you're a social media company, we're going to put an extra levy or an extra fee on top of the taxes that you pay of 2.25% of the revenue that you make in Australia from Australian businesses, mainly through advertising. So for the simplicity of numbers, let's say that if a company makes $100 million, they've now got under this scheme an extra $2.25 million.
Which 2.25% doesn't sound like a lot, but given how much these companies are making,
huge sums of money.
It's a lot of money.
Yeah. So the government says you've got this new levy. There are 2 things you can do. Mr. Social Media Company or Mrs. Social Media Company.
It's very inclusive of you.
You can either pay that straight to us as the government. We're then going to go away, make an independent body and distribute that sum of money to Australian media companies. We don't know how that's going to happen yet. We'll put that to another episode. Or you can go to media companies yourself and you can do these commercial agreements. And if you do those commercial agreements, we'll make sure that that levy tax bill gets reduced. But it's not reduced 1 for 1. So if your tax bill is 2.25 million and you do a deal with the Daily Aus and you give the Daily Aus $1 million, we'll take off $1.7 million off that bill. So for every dollar you give a media company, 1.7 comes off it. And so if you wanted to reduce your tax bill, go and do deals yourself. So that leaves social media companies in a really interesting position.
Either do a deal and reduce your tax bill, or don't do a deal
and just pay it. Yeah.
Or do neither of the above, ignore it, and withdraw completely from the market.
Which is the big fear here, right? Is that as you've mentioned the Canada example, that is kind of the nuclear scenario that social media companies could take is you're not earning money in the country if you're not operating in the country, essentially. And there's so much that could happen between here and that. That is almost seen by everybody as the last step into this.
Okay, and so that's...
I hope that was kind of easy to understand.
I mean, it's easy for me to understand because we own a media company, but I think like it isn't an inherently straightforward thing, you know, but I think that you described it well. So there's this push now for basically social media companies to go ahead and make deals with media companies.
Yeah, if the law passes.
If the law passes and things need to happen for that to go ahead. How has big tech responded to this? Because I can't imagine they're thrilled by the prospect of paying even more money now.
No, they're universally disappointed. I'd say they are
not angry, just disappointed.
They are. They're very. I mean, this has been a long process for everybody involved. They've been saying the same thing for many years, which is essentially that this is like a really blunt tax that discourages tech companies from being involved in the Australian economy. It doesn't benefit news companies in the way that the government hopes it would, because news companies don't have to be transparent about where they're spending the money. There's all of those kind of arguments. And so, I mean, Meta has been the most blunt in its assessment, basically saying they could be exploring potential legal challenges to it. And there's kind of this consensus that this is the worst case scenario for them. On the media side of things, there's some very happy people in media companies because this almost opens up entirely new revenue streams. There's also some concern from parts of the media, you know, what classifies something as a media company is a really interesting discussion.
Very existential.
Very. How we ensure that independent media companies get these deals, not just the big players in town?
Yeah, I think that's a big thing to draw on, which is that under the 2021 law, basically the large majority of the money went to Nine and News Corp, the two biggest media companies in Australia. They got millions upon millions of dollars. There wasn't a whole lot of oversight about where that was spent. And, you know, publishers like TDA, who granted we were basically tiny / non-existent at that point, but you would have never been in those sorts of rooms. And so now the idea is, well, how are we making sure that if there are these funds, they are actually being distributed in a way that is nourishing the sector and not just making the big players even bigger? I want to end by asking you, as the co-founder of the Daily Aus, what is your view on this? And I know that it's not black and white, and we've been through a bit of a journey, and perhaps we're even deeply, I'm just going to speak for both of us, fatigued by this conversation that has dominated, you know, basically every chat we've had since 2021. Where are you at on it?
It's very, our emotions and our strategy in how we are approaching this is complicated because on one hand, we don't fundamentally think that media companies should get money from tech companies.
Why?
Because part of innovation is evolving with the times. And the example that we've used before is...
You mean revenue models wise?
Yeah. The example that we've used before is, you know, there's physical retail and then eBay comes along and Gumtree comes along and revolutionizes the way that we shop. The Iconic comes along. You don't see physical retail brands saying we demand to do a deal with eBay to make sure that things are fair again. You see physical retail expanding their online presence and making products online that are more authentic to new ways that people shop.
Yeah.
So that's kind of one side of things.
But I do think that that is a somewhat blanket view on it because, for example, we received funding from Google to help us with a specific project, which was actually about how do we build newsletter and how do we, it costs a lot of money to be able to build something like that. For us, that was about how can we continue to grow this company sustainably. It wasn't just money that was a free-for-all. It was a finite amount that we used to really grow a certain element of our business.
And that's kind of the other side of the coin, right, is that the news media industry needs help. And no company in the news media industry is looking at the next 5, 10, 15, 20 years
feeling good about it.
Full of confidence. And despite all of that, the wants and needs of audiences are still there and they're still growing. So there's no change in the demand for news. People want news.
There's a change in trust for news.
There's a lot of change in trust, and perhaps one of the things that would shore up trust and make sure that a whole generation of young people trust and believe the news that they're receiving is well-funded news that can do their job well. And so you're never going to get a news company, I don't think, saying no, blanket no to any funding. But there's always a discussion about what does that change in terms of the ability to report on those companies and or I think obligations.
Also, I think also who it's going to.
Sure.
If we have existing dynamics in the market, which mean that, 2/3 of our media market is concentrated with one owner. Are we just about giving more money to that company?
And when you give money to a company, where's it going? Is it going to executives? Is it going to journalists? Is it going to a new office, fit out? There's so much here.
It's very complicated.
Yeah, but I hope to kind of bring everyone with us because this is important.
It is important. So let us know what you think about this idea. I mean, should big tech be paying news media companies to exist on their platforms? We want to hear from you. Let us know. That's all we have for today's podcast, though. We will be back later today with headlines. But until then, have a great day.